Hello, History 17B, Autumn Quarter 2023. We are heading into the actual time period of the course now and not just into review to catch up. We are starting Module B with this lecture. The period after the Civil War saw the United States grow in every conceivable dimension: geographic extent, population, immigration, urbanization, industrialization, communications, transportation. The U.S. was growing explosively in all of these. This is where we left off on the state of the U.S. soon after the Civil War ended. In this module, I will split the U.S. into 3 or possibly 4 lectures. We will start with lecture 4 here in the South. The Civil War officially ended in 1865. But it was not as if a new and improved version of the U.S. sprang into being immediately after, or arguably at all. Historians generally end the period called Reconstruction with the presidential election of 1877. In that time, the U.S. had to settle issues such as, could members of the former Confederacy be taken back as U.S. citizens? Who would pay to clean up the devastation left in the former Confederate states? And how to integrate thousands of people who had been enslaved but were now legally free citizens into an economy and society that had been based on treating them as property rather than full people. This lecture has ended up on the long side, so I am splitting it into 2 parts. The first part will be a lot of political history. The second part will focus more on how people on the ground dealt with the overarching politics and power around them. The key points and the coda will be with part 2. There's no way to really understand what happened during Reconstruction without having some grasp of national politics at the time. If we zoom in on the South in the map that we saw earlier, you will see that the last Confederate forces to surrender were here in this area, which you will notice the U.S. called Indian Territory. This was not land still held by the people who had lived there when the United States formed, but by the peoples of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, who had been cleared out and forced to walk from their land to what is now Oklahoma. That journey is called the Trail of Tears, partly because of the level of fatality sustained by Native Americans. That so-called removal was pretty much completed by 1850, so before the Civil War, but it is not as if the people displaced who survived just somehow disappeared. They were living here, trying to adjust to land and living conditions that bore next to no resemblance to what they had been forced to leave. You will also notice to the west that although the U.S. claimed these white areas, this is part of Texas, they did not actually control them. At this time, the Comanche in particular proved particularly formidable to American colonists. Finally, all of the former Confederate states are marked as being occupied by the U.S. military. These states had seceded or removed themselves from the United States. They represented, at this point, occupied enemy territory in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. This map shows the military districts established in the South to try to ensure that the rebelling states could be safely absorbed back into the United States. Each of these 5 districts was overseen by a general of the Federal Army. You will also see that the map includes 2 dates for each state. The top one for when the state officially rejoined the Union or was accepted back in and thus had Congress members, and the bottom one, the time when the state returned to what the map rather euphemistically calls conservative rule. What this actually means is that almost all Black people who had been elected to positions at any level, but especially the local, had been forced out of office. In fact, in most cases, the people in charge, including members of the U.S. Congress from the South, were exactly the same people who had been in charge when their states seceded from the U.S. By 1870, all former Confederate states had rejoined the U.S., but at a great cost to Black Americans across the South. The period immediately after the American Civil War is called Reconstruction. I have found over the course of my life, part of it lived in the South, that many Americans assumed that what was being reconstructed was the South. The South was deeply damaged by the war, which was pretty much all fought on Southern territory. However, the repair of the infrastructure in the South is called rebuilding. What was being reconstructed during Reconstruction was the United States, the country. This cartoon was made in 1865. It's in the Library of Congress. You can find it on their website, and it also is shown in your YAWP textbook. It is critiquing both Lincoln over here and his vice president, Andrew Johnson. So clearly this was published before 14 April of 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated. Calling Lincoln the rail splitter was a reference to his impoverished or lower class origins. The criticism here is that Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was actually quite lenient to the South. And by South here, we mean the former Confederacy and members of it. The losing states had essentially committed treason and had certainly been responsible for a war that killed more than 360,000 federal soldiers, meaning those from the North. The families of those men were not in a particularly forgiving mood, nor were many other Americans in northern states. And Black Americans had even greater reasons for not wanting the South to return to what white Southerners wanted to consider normal. If you watched the coda to Lecture 2, one of the timelines that I showed was centered on American political parties. These have changed dramatically over time. Today, we tend to see Republican as mainly from the Southeast and the interior of the country, as well as in the Northeast. We associate Democrats with the Northeast and the coast, especially in regions with higher populations, although many, though by no means all, Black people in the South tend to vote for Democrats. This actually represents a complete reversal of the parties, a process that started in the mid to late 20th century and which we will look at later in this course. The political parties at the end of the American Civil War looked very different. Republicans were mainly white Americans born in the U.S. and living in the Northeast, and Black Americans. These people were anti-enslavement and also often pro-tariff. For radical Republicans, just note the name here, the term here, and we will return to it in a moment. The Democrats at the end of the Civil War were mainly white Americans born in the U.S. and living in the Southeast, and some European immigrants to the Northeast, and we won't worry about these yet. These people were generally fine with the enslavement of other people and also were often anti-tariff. We also often take it for granted that in presidential elections, president and vice president are from the same political party. But this also was quite different in the mid-19th century. In the 1864 election, the ticket was made up of Lincoln, a Republican, and Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee. The point of the mixed ticket here was to try to forestall a conflict like the American Civil War by trying to cover the concerns of both the North and the South. Clearly, this did not work. As the earlier cartoon suggested, many people felt that Lincoln's plan for reconstruction of the Union was far too accommodating to white Southerners who had started a rebellion resulting in massive casualties. However, Lincoln's plan was positively stringent compared with the plan that Johnson settled on when he became president after Lincoln's assassination. Members of the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government had very different ideas about the goals of Reconstruction and how those should be achieved. Radical Republicans, so here we come to a group in the Republican Party, but not the entire Republican Party at the time. Radical Republican members of Congress saw securing the civil rights of Black people and the reorganization of both the economy and culture in the South to do away with racial inequality as the top priority. Lincoln and Johnson saw the reconstitution of the U.S. by readmission of formerly rebel states to be the top priority. Radical Republican Reconstruction wanted to ensure full civil rights for formerly enslaved people and to transform the society and economy of the South. Of the three Reconstruction plans, Radical Republican, Lincoln, and Johnson, that of the Radical Republicans had the least success. That said, congressional Republicans, remember we're talking about the 1860s Republican Party, not the current one, Republicans in Congress did manage to push through laws that at least mitigated or tried to Reconstruction plans that ignored the rights of Black Americans. I've put these up here: Civil Rights Act of 1866, Reconstruction Acts, and Reconstruction Amendments, so you know where they came from when we talk about them later. This was mainly defensive legislation that aimed to make a bad situation less bad, because radical Republicans did not have the numbers or the power to enact the sort of legislation that they actually wanted. Lincoln's plan focused first and foremost on remaking a unified U.S. and federal government. His one big stipulation was that for a state that seceded and joined the Confederacy, 10% of those who had voted in 1860, and that means exclusively white men, had to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. So that's why Lincoln's plan is often called the 10% plan. And 10% isn't really very much. The plan included no provisions or protections for Black Americans. As it was, Lincoln was assassinated pretty much right after the end of the Civil War, so this plan was basically dead on arrival. If you have looked at the pop culture package, then you know how important newspapers, I've shown you a couple of newspapers here, were becoming, and also that people played music and sang for entertainment. The Nation in Tears here is sheet music that people would have bought and played at home or in town gatherings. Lincoln's assassination left the U.S. with Andrew Johnson as president. Johnson was a Democrat from the border state of Tennessee. Johnson had no problem with the enslavement of people, having kept people enslaved himself. He was, however, resentful of Southern aristocrats, so he opposed slavery during the American Civil War as a way of getting at them, but otherwise he did not really care much. Initially, Johnson's Reconstruction plan required Confederate civilian and military officers and those who owned more than $20,000 in property to obtain a presidential pardon in order to be admitted back into the United States. But this was really to make them grovel before him, and eventually he did not even require that. When all was said and done, most of the Southerners who had been in the U.S. Congress before they rebelled rejoined the U.S. Congress after the war. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, pretty much before the dust had settled, white people in the South set about trying to return Black Americans to a position as close to enslavement as possible. They did this in two ways. The first was the use of terrorism and paramilitary forces to harm and intimidate both Black Americans and Republicans, white and Black, who had managed to obtain any sort of political hold, locally or nationally. Those at the local level were, of course, the most vulnerable to violence. The most famous of these terrorist organizations is, of course, the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, formed by Confederate veterans in Tennessee in 1865. But the KKK was by no means unique. There were other groups like the Knights of the White Camellia and some other ones. The other method used to reestablish white power in the South was to pass laws called Black Codes. Black codes varied a bit from state to state, but basically they made it impossible for Black people to move from place to place, to start businesses or own land, and even in the case of vagrancy laws, to sit down and rest. This sounds extreme because it was extreme. The examples on this slide are from Mississippi. I know that they may be too small to see, especially depending on what kind of screen you're watching this on, but you can listen as I read parts. Mississippi Black Codes enact to confer civil rights on freedmen and for other purposes. So they make it sound like they're granting civil rights, but it's really the other purposes they're going for here. Section 3, it shall not be lawful for any Black person to intermarry with any white person, nor for any white person to intermarry with any Black person. And any person who shall so intermarry shall be deemed guilty of felony, and on conviction thereof shall be confined to the state penitentiary for life. This is part of dehumanizing Black people, because if people get together and they start acting like ordinary human beings, then they do things like get married to one another. And in fact, they had done so in the early days of the United States. So this is straight up meant to separate people and to dehumanize one group. Section 7, every civil officer shall, and every person may, and by person, they mean white person here, arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer any Black person who shall have quit the service of his or her employer before the expiration of his or her term of service without good cause. Now, that sounds a little unclear. It sounds like, oh, the employee was breaking contract, but the contract here was very much coercive. So in section 2 of an act to amend the vagrant laws of the state, all Black people in this state over the age of 18 years with no lawful employment or business shall be deemed vagrants. And here's the deal. If someone was deemed a vagrant, they could be arrested and pressed into service. So a day without a job, an afternoon not working, could get you arrested and signed up for work, not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the state. The South Carolina Black Codes on this slide are even smaller, but again, I will read them. Some misdemeanors, section 22. No person of color shall migrate into or reside in this state unless within 20 days after his arrival within the same, he shall enter into a bond with 2 freeholders as sureties. Contracts for service, 35. All persons of color who make contracts for service or labor shall be known as servants, and those with whom they contract shall be known as masters. So clearly here, rather than having employer-employee, which would carry much more the sense of freedom to make contract, they're in the law pulling back the word master. Mechanics, artisans, and shopkeepers. No person of color shall pursue or practice the art, trade, or business of an artisan, mechanic, or shopkeeper, or any other trade, employment, or business besides that of husbandry, that means farming in this case, or that of a servant under a contract for service or labor on his own account and for his own benefit, or in partnership with a white person, until he shall have obtained a license, therefore, from the judge of the district court, which license shall be good for 1 year only. In other words, you couldn't have a skilled job. You couldn't own a business. You couldn't own your own land. You could farm for someone else, or you could be a servant for someone else. And by someone, the law meant someone white. Vagrancy and idleness. This is 96. All persons who have not some fixed and known place of abode and some lawful and respectable employment shall be deemed vagrants and be liable to the punishment hereinafter described. And that punishment is described in number 98. The defendant, if sentenced to hard labor after conviction, may be hired for such wages as can be obtained for his services to any owner or lessee of a farm for the term of labor to which he was sentenced. And by hiring here, they don't mean that they're paying the laborer. They mean that they're hiring the laborer from the state. Radical Republicans in Congress sought to counter both the terrorist activities and the Black codes in the South by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And that act recognized the citizenship rights of Black Americans and gave the federal government the power to see that those rights were, in fact, protected. Johnson used his presidential power to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, Congress at that point managed to pull together a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. That's the only way you can override the veto. Congress tried to ensure Black civil rights with the so-called Reconstruction Acts. Those were 1867-68. They were the ones that divided the former Confederate states, except for Tennessee, into 5 military districts and outlined the process of readmission to the Union, including ratification of the 14th Amendment and the extension of suffrage to Black men, as well as drafting a state constitution to be approved by the U.S. Congress. Don't worry about the 14th Amendment yet. We will get there. You will recognize the pattern here of pass, veto, override. This was a constant battle, both in Congress and even more immediately for Black Americans in the South. And once the Southern states began to be readmitted, it would become pretty much impossible to get the 2/3 majority to override a veto, a presidential veto. Laws can be bounced around, vetoed, repealed, and just flat ignored. The subset of the U.S. Congress actually invested in reshaping the South and guaranteeing civil rights to Black Americans, that would be the Radical Republicans, felt that they needed something much stronger than a regular law. Amending the U.S. Constitution seemed like the sort of drastic measure needed, although even constitutional rights, when not protected, have little practical meaning on the ground. Amending the U.S. Constitution is not and was not a trivial nor easy process. Briefly, it requires a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Then it goes to the states and must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. This graphic here is clearly recent, as there were not 50 states after the Civil War. And the other part of this graphic, amending the Constitution, I left it here because you should know, it can also be done through conventions, but that doesn't apply here, so I'm not going to go into it, but just so that you are aware. In terms of what happened when, I've taken events a bit out of order to focus first on plans of Reconstruction, then on the back and forth between legislative and executive branches, and only then on the constitutional amendments. If you look at the timeline here, you will see that the creation of the Reconstruction Amendments was part of this entire messy legal struggle going on in the federal government. I've pulled things out of the mess, and I am also skipping over the impeachment of Andrew Johnson here. This is one place where the YAWP readings could fill in some of the details of standard history that I am bypassing for the sake of clarity. The Reconstruction Amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. You can see the effort to guarantee Black people's civil rights in the face of resistance from white Southerners and Andrew Johnson. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The white South met it with Black codes. The 14th Amendment made it clear that Black Americans were citizens and should have the rights of citizenship. The white South met it with poll taxes and other legal machinations to make it difficult or impossible for Black men to vote. The 15th Amendment directly addressed the voting rights of Black men, but white Southerners found ways around that as well. This is generally the way we describe what the amendments did: outlawed, guaranteed, gave. But constitutional amendments are rather tricky things. They don't actually guarantee anything like freedom in the positive sense. They are phrased in the negative. You are looking at the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865. And if you remember back to the Johnson Plan of Reconstruction, he was forced to include ratification of the 13th Amendment into the requirements for a former Confederate state to rejoin the United States. The actual 13th Amendment is quite short, just the part in the red box there. The rest is signatures and "be it resolved" language. The text in the box on the right is a transcript of the entire 13th Amendment. As amendments go, the 13th is fairly straightforward. At heart, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. Saying that slavery shall not exist is not quite the same thing as saying that freedom will exist. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the federal government's first pass at defining citizenship at the national level, and you saw how tenuous that was. Congress had already been developing the 14th Amendment. They were under no illusions. Released in 1866, but not ratified by enough states to pass until 1868, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is said to guarantee birthright citizenship and equal protection of the laws. But remember, amendments are tricksy things without positive guarantees. And of all of the amendments, the 14th is arguably the trickiest. It is also the bedrock for the basic civil rights that we take for granted on a day-to-day basis. There are four main parts to the 14th Amendment: citizenship rights, equal protection, apportionment, and Civil War debt. This is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of any state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So the parts I've highlighted, the first is birthright citizenship. And prior to this, citizenship hadn't actually been defined at the federal level. States kind of granted or didn't grant citizenship, and it wasn't really clear what qualified a person to be a citizen. So this said, someone born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen. And the second part of this is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Note that states cannot mess with the rights of citizens, but citizens in the state who happen to have greater social and economic power are literally not held back here by this amendment. Section 2 basically says that if a state restricts the right to vote, it will get fewer representatives in Congress. So representatives shall be apportioned, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. When the right to vote is denied any male, representation shall be reduced. Note that Indians do not count as full citizens with representation in the federal government. And this not taxed, there's a little bit more going on here. If, for some groups of Native Americans, if they left their group, their tribal identity, and bought a plot of land and tried to act like white Americans and paid taxes, then they could vote unless they were actively stopped from doing so. But any Native American who kept their identity as Native American couldn't vote. I will also point out that this is the first time that the word male is specified in the Constitution. This was done deliberately because some females were beginning to agitate for the right to vote. Section 3 was clearly intended to keep former Confederates from returning to places in government, particularly Congress. No person shall hold any office who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion. But, that last highlighted word, but, you can see that there is already a door open to get around this. And you know that most former Confederates in the U.S. Congress came back to positions of power in the decade after the American Civil War ended. Section 4 says that the government will not pay enslavers for people that they had regarded as property and were forced to free by the 13th Amendment. It says other things, but that's the highlighted part. Now, this might seem straightforward to us, of course. Why would you pay someone for a human being when you've just made that illegal? But Great Britain had, in fact, paid enslavers compensation when the country ended slavery. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution tried to make certain that Black Americans in the South could vote. If we look more closely at the section in the blue box, we can see how hard advocates in Congress were trying to make this ironclad. But we also see that this is not a positive, guaranteed, all citizens shall be able to vote. Instead, we have the U.S. and state governments cannot limit suffrage, but nothing about local governments or private citizens explicitly here. Another thing to note is the protected categories: race, color, previous condition of servitude. The category sex does not appear, and not because Congress didn't think about it. This, like the inclusion of the word male in the 14th Amendment, was quite deliberate. In both cases, this was not meant just to stick it to women, although that certainly was a feature for many congressmen. Remember that constitutional amendments must be approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then by 3/4 of state legislatures. This means that all sorts of compromises have to be made, and when it becomes clear that something like an amendment will pass, congressmen who oppose it still have an opportunity to undermine it. Prior to universal emancipation by the 13th Amendment, the abolition movement and women's rights movement had significant overlap in membership and goals. And even more to the point, they provided a much more formidable and effective push for change than either movement could have achieved alone. Deliberately not including sex in the 15th Amendment was meant to drive a wedge between the newly forming Black civil rights activism and women's activism, and it worked even better than those responsible had hoped. Not only did it effectively create a distinction between civil rights for women and civil rights for Black people, it also took advantage of latent racism in the white women's suffrage organizations to split the women's movement into those who backed the 15th Amendment as it was without the word sex, and those who refused to back it if women were not included. The move also marginalized Black women to an even greater extent. Black women were not silent on the issues that faced them because of the intersection of race and sex, but their voices were often effectively drowned out in popular debates when the question was one of suffrage for Black women, increasing levels of violence towards Black people, which is saying a lot since such violence had long been acceptable to white Southerners, also drew off the energies of Black women activists. You are looking at Ida B. Wells, an ardent woman suffragist, even though she was forced to march at the end of a women's suffrage parade by white organizers. Wells, later Wells Barnett, so you may see that, lost friends to lynching. Much of her time and energy went into trying to get the U.S. federal government to stop rampant murders of Black men in the South by white Southerners. I am going to leave part 1 here with Ida B. Wells, and I will not actually see you, but talk to you in part 2.